They could buy Africa. They were wrong. 3 weeks ago, Benjamin Netanyahu's government sent me a letter that changed everything, not just for Burkina Faso, but for this entire continent. Let me tell you exactly what happened because the world needs to hear this story.
The world did not expect the thunder to come from Ouagadougou. In the eyes of many, Burkina Faso was just another small, poor, landlocked nation in the Sahel, known more for its struggles and its triumphs. But then a young soldier with a fire of rebellion in his eyes rose to power, and in one bold stroke, he changed the rhythm of global politics. His name was IBRAHIM Traoré, and the act that shook the world would come to be remembered as a $5 billion shock. To understand why it was such a shock, you have to imagine the scene. A man barely in his 30s, a soldier rather than a polished politician, standing before the world and refusing to bow. He was not a seasoned diplomat with the careful words of negotiation. He was a son of Burkina Faso, a land once called Upper Volta, born into a soil soaked with the memory of colonial chains, hunger, and endless battles for dignity. And yet in his voice there was no hesitation. He declared that the West no longer held a monopoly over Africa's destiny. He declared that the era of exploitation was over. And then, as if to etch those words into history, he delivered a counterblow so audacious, so unbelievable, that it sent shockwaves through Washington, Paris, and Brussels alike. A $5 billion demand, a counterstrike against the arrogance of powers that always assumed Africa would kneel. It was not just about money. The sum itself mattered less than the message. For decades, the West had treated Africa as a place to extract wealth, not a place to repay it. Gold, cotton, uranium, oil, all had flowed out of the continent, while poverty and instability flowed in. For centuries, the price of exploitation had never been tallied. Now, IBRAHIM Traoré dared to name a number, and in doing so, he pulled a veil from a global hypocrisy. The young leader was no stranger to the weight of history. Burkina Faso was the land of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary who in the 1980s had refused to be a puppet of foreign powers. Sankara had changed the name of the nation from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. He had insisted that Africans should grow their own food, wear their own clothes, depend on their own strength. But Sankara was killed in a coup, a bullet silencing his voice, and many in Burkina Faso believed Western hands were hidden in the shadows of his death. His dream was buried, and for decades the country slipped back into dependency, dancing to tunes played in Paris and Washington. So when IBRAHIM Traoré appeared, young, fiery, unpolished yet uncompromising, people whispered that Sankara had returned in another form. He wore the uniform of a soldier, not the tailored suits of Western-educated elites. He spoke directly, often bluntly, and his words carried the raw anger of a people tired of being treated as pawns. When he said Africa must stand tall, the youth of the continent listened. They shared his speeches on TikTok and WhatsApp, his words spreading faster than any government could suppress. And then, when the $5 billion shock was announced, they erupted in joy. Finally, here was someone who dared to put a price on the centuries of robbery. In Western capitals, the reaction was immediate. Newspapers called him a populist. Commentators dismissed him as reckless. Diplomats muttered that he was being manipulated by other global powers. But behind the scenes, there was fear. The fear was not that Burkina Faso could actually win billions from the West. It was that other African leaders might follow his example. What if Niger demanded repayment for its uranium? What if Congo asked for compensation for rubber and cobalt that built Western industries? What if the continent as a whole began to calculate the real cost of colonialism? The numbers would not be billions, they would be trillions. The audacity of Traoré's move was its real power. Africa had grown accustomed to asking, to pleading, to negotiating from a position of weakness. Traoré flipped the script. He was not asking politely for aid. He was not appealing for loans tied with humiliating conditions. He was telling the West, "You owe us. Pay up." The people of Burkina Faso loved him for it. In the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, young men painted his face on walls. Vendors played his speeches on radios while selling roasted corn. Women in marketplaces raised their fists and said, "This is our son, our lion." And in the countryside, where French soldiers had long patrolled in the name of counterterrorism, but failed to bring peace, villagers said at last someone had spoken the truth. that foreign troops were not there to help but to guard their interests. But the $5 billion shock was not only about Burkina Faso. It was about Africa as a whole. When Traoré stood tall, leaders in Mali, Niger, and Guinea nodded. Across the continent, whispers grew louder. If he can say it, why can't we? The idea spread like fire through dry grass. Sovereignty, self-respect, independence, words that had grown dusty with overuse were suddenly alive again. Of course, the West was not going to let it pass without response. Already, economic levers were being pulled. Aid packages were delayed. Sanctions were whispered about. Military cooperation agreements were put under review. The message was clear: defy us, and you will pay the price. But Ibrahim Traoré did not blink. On the contrary, he spoke louder. He pointed to Russia and China, saying Africa had other partners. He embraced Pan-Africanism, calling for unity among Sahel nations, urging Africans to stand shoulder to shoulder against external pressure. He spoke of dignity as if it were more valuable than gold, more precious than dollars. The $5 billion shock also revealed the hypocrisy of Western narratives. For years, Western leaders had spoken of democracy, human rights, and partnership. Yet, when an African leader demanded fairness, when he asked for accountability, they mocked him, painted him as dangerous, and plotted ways to weaken him. It showed that what the West really feared was not instability, but independence. They preferred African leaders who bowed, who smiled politely while signing exploitive contracts, who thanked them for crumbs while their nations bled wealth. Traoré was different, and that difference made him dangerous. As days turned into weeks, the shock did not fade. It grew. On African social media, hashtags celebrated him. In university halls from Dakar to Nairobi, students debated his boldness. Was it realistic? Perhaps not. But was it necessary? Absolutely. It forced the world to look at Africa differently, not as a helpless beggar, but as a creditor demanding what was due. For the West, the challenge was deeper than one lawsuit or one speech. The challenge was psychological. It was a collapse of an old hierarchy, the crumbling of a narrative in which the West always spoke and Africa always listened. When Ibrahim Traoré declared a $5 billion counterblow, he was not just speaking to Washington or Paris. He was speaking to history. He was speaking to the ghosts of Sankara, Lumumba, Nkrumah, and all those who had dreamed of an Africa that could stand without leaning on foreign crutches. And yet, there was danger ahead. The history of Africa is littered with the corpses of those who dared too much. Sankara assassinated. Lumumba executed. Gaddafi bombed into oblivion. The pattern was clear. The world system did not tolerate African defiance for long. Traoré knew this. He often said that he was not afraid of death, that he was ready to sacrifice for his people. His courage made him a hero to some and a threat to others. As the tension mounted, people asked,